for you after the webinar. And so what we're going to do, as I see somebody pop up there, I keep everybody muted on this because I've done enough of these over the years that you hear dogs barking and babies crying, so to kind of keep this, pure for the thing. So anyway, and I see you there, Brenda. You can keep your camera on if you want to. You can look like a bit like you're the witness protection program, but that's all right. But anyway, let's get started. So we're talking today about help my groups are stuck at 30%, which is a very common place to be stuck. So good for you. If you're here and you're stuck there, you can get out of there. I've been stuck there. That's how this has all happened. If you don't know me, my name is Alan White. I've been a pastor for over 25 years. My wife and I have been married going on 19 years now. Her name is Tiffany. And we have 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. Our boys are 17, 13, and 5. And our daughter is 11. And my wife and 2 of our children are on their way to Seattle, Washington. Her grandfather is celebrating his 95th birthday. And this was all planned before the hurricane evacuation because I live in Greenville, South Carolina. And one of the models says that the hurricane is going to come trucking right through here. We hope that's not the case. But if it is the case, we're prepared. But it was funny yesterday because all these models are saying so many different things. I mean, it could affect everything from northeast Alabama to Charleston, West Virginia. That's how broad this thing has become. And so Greg Surratt, who's the founding pastor at Seacoast Church down in Charleston, posted on his Instagram a picture of the eastern United States, the East Coast, with the whole thing circled. And inside it says, it will hit somewhere, sometime. And that was his forecast, that somewhere on the East Coast it's going to hit. I've coached over 1,500 churches in various ways. Since 2011, I've helped to start over 15,000 groups in the churches that I've worked with, and that's involved connecting some 125,000 people into groups. So that's a God thing, and very excited to be a part of that. What I do, I work with churches through individual coaching, where I work with a church one-on-one. I have coaching groups where I work with 5 churches at a time. I've developed a couple of online courses, one about launching exponential groups, one on coaching. I have 2 books, and those books are, my first book I published last year with Hendrickson Publishers out of Peabody, Mass. It's called Exponential Groups, Unleashing Your Church's Potential. And my new book was just released last month called Leading Healthy Groups, a Guide for Small Group Leaders. So the Exponential Groups book is more for guys like you, pastor people, and small group directors, small group leaders, volunteer teams. Leading Healthy Groups is for the small group leader. And I started it with a lot of questions my leaders used to ask me. And so, kind of questions from real leaders about real issues, and then added a number of other things in there, all the way down to the person who's leading for the first time. How do you arrange the furniture? How do you get ready for your first meeting? And then I also blog at alanwhite.org. If you've ever been over there or ever want to go. All right, so let's talk about why maybe you're here. So where you are feeling the pain. Maybe recruiting new leaders. That's always a trick, isn't it? Forming new groups, group health and growth, connecting new people into groups, vision, culture, the value for groups, some of these kinds of things that are kind of persistent things in the small group world. And then why do groups get stuck at 30%? And here's what I've discovered. And again, I feel like I can speak to this because once upon a time, and you'll hear my story in a minute, but once upon a time, my groups were stuck at 30%, actually in both churches I've served. So part of the reason you're stuck at 30% is, first of all, you already have the low-hanging fruit. So the people, the easy invitations, you knew that if you had asked them that they would say, oh, sure, I'll be a small group leader. People that are loyal, people that are interested in trying new things. So we already have those. And that's part of your 30%. So most of your early adopters are already in. Maybe you're still handpicking leaders. So you're still personally inviting people to lead groups. And that can go so far, but it can't take you all the way. And so sometimes you need to begin to try other ways of recruiting, which we'll get into in a minute. You're forming groups only one way. And so here's the thing, and I'll just let the cat out of the bag right now, is that there is no single strategy. There's no one strategy that's going to get all of your people connected into groups. It doesn't exist. But here's the other part. There's no rule that says you only have to use one strategy to connect your people into groups. You can use multiple strategies. Sometimes the biggest mistake we make is that we take something that's worked for, say, up to 30% of our congregation. It doesn't get us any further than that. We completely change the whole model. We upset the apple cart and then try something new. And I think rather than doing that, we stick with what's working and then add something to it to get the next number of people that are interested in being part of groups. Maybe you're coaching all the leaders by yourself, and coaching is a big part of helping your groups to grow, and coaching by yourself is a good way to get stuck and frustrated. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey, and if you've been on another webinar and you've heard this story before, I hope you find some comfort in the fact that my story doesn't change. It's still the same story. So my journey from being stuck to being unstuck, I graduated from seminary in 1990, back when Paisley ties were popular, and went to a church in the Central Valley of California near Modesto called New Life Christian Center. It was about 300 adults at the time. I was the minister of Christian education. And then about a year and a half into it, I'm right out of seminary. I'm 25 years old. So a year and a half later, some things were found out about our founding pastor, and he had to resign. And needless to say, that wasn't good for the church. In fact, all of the staff left except for me, and all of the members left except for 85 people. So it was me and 85 people, and this is now 26 years ago. And that was it. We felt like the church had just kind of died. The very last Sunday of that year, they officially confirmed our new pastor. Now, this time he was 30, I was 28, and I'd had a birthday. But anyway, a couple of birthdays there. And, to say that we were green was, an understatement. And so the first thing he did in the spring of 1993, he took me down to Southern California to hear this pastor I had never heard of before, called Rick Warren, talk about the purpose-driven church. And we got all excited, how, Rick puts a lot of things together. Purpose-driven church is old hat now. It's kind of hard to believe. There was a time in my life I didn't know who Rick Warren was. But anyway, they really put a lot of things together for us, and what we were going to try at our church. And to be honest with you, we came back and looked at our 85 people. We thought, how in the world are we going to pull this off? And our growth wasn't dramatic. We grew incrementally. We grew by maybe 100 people a year, and I was there for another 12 years, 15 years total with that church. And over that 12 years, we continued to grow by about 100 a year. Now we got to about 250 people, and the complaint from our members was, I don't know everybody anymore. And maybe you've experienced that from your members. And, one of the things Rick Warren talks about is that it's not important that everybody knows everyone, but it's important that everybody knows somebody. And so we thought at that point, we need to get into groups. And then we got to about 400 and went to 2 services. And then the complaint was more like, we can't find the people that we know. So we knew we had to do groups. So I recruited 10 group leaders. And the idea of this was that they were going to develop an apprentice. You heard this logic before. They were going to raise up an apprentice. They were going to train that apprentice. And then the next year, they were going to send that apprentice out, maybe with part of the group, and they were going to help start a new group. So I figured within 5 years, we were going to catch up with the current number of people we had in our church and anticipate the growth. Here's the thing. It wasn't up and to the right like this. We started out with 10, and the next year we added a few more, and they couldn't find an apprentice. They'd walk up to me on Sunday morning and they'd say, I'm working on my apprentice. And then they would walk by me. And I thought, whatever happened to hello? I'm working, but I put so much pressure on them because I was convinced that the way that our small group ministry was going to grow was that everybody had to have an apprentice. And if they didn't have an apprentice, this was going to be a big flop and I was going to look bad, which is great motivation for doing ministry, right? I'm going to look bad. But anyway, so I would recruit people out of their groups and put them in what we called a turbo group. And so it was a training group, and then everybody out of that group was launched into leading a group. And so some years we started 10 new groups. One year we started 2 new groups. One year we didn't start any. I mean, like, I recruited them and they were in the training group. They went through the training and they got to the end of the training, ready to launch the groups, and they said, yeah, no. So we had a lot of ups and downs. It had a heartbeat, but that was about it. So we got to a place where we were about 7 years into our 5-year strategy for groups. And what we realized was we were stuck. I mean, stuck. We had 30% of our adults in groups. I'll give you actual numbers. We were 800 adults on the weekend, and we had about 300 people, maybe a little less, in about 30 groups. And it was stuck. I'd worked 7 years, and that's where we couldn't get any further. And then I met this guy. I went down to a conference in Orange County. Orange County. I think the key to this is go to Orange County and get all your learning, right? But anyway, I met this guy named Brett Eastman, who had been the small group pastor at Saddleback. Prior to that, he'd been on the small group team at Willow Creek. And he had a ministry called Life Together. And he began talking about these ideas of how you could multiply groups without dividing them. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but in North America, groups like to stay together. They don't want to break off and form new groups. They want to be kind of a close, tight-knit, extended family. So when you say, instead of saying we're going to divide the groups, our euphemism is we're going to multiply the groups. The reality is what that feels like to our small group members is that they're getting a small group divorce. And that doesn't feel very good. So Brett was talking about how these things that you put the pastor's teaching on video, and you could recruit leaders, you could multiply groups without dividing them. And I got all excited about this. And I'm driving home. It's about a 350-mile drive, thinking, how in the world is this going to work in my church? Now, at this point, it's 2004. And the one thing that's on my senior pastor's mind is the Passion of the Christ. Because the film was about to be released, he knew that once people saw the film, people were going to have a lot of spiritual questions. And so he'd planned a sermon series around the Passion of the Christ. He had purchased some advertising. We were on the main artery north and south in California. We had a banner out on the freeway. I mean, the whole bit. And so I walked into his office and I said, here's the thing, Pastor Dave. I said, what if we launched small groups off of the Passion of the Christ? And he said, oh, I think that's a great idea. Now, notice what I did there. I took something that he was passionate about, which was the Passion of the Christ, and I just piggybacked on that. So most of my 28 years now of ministry, I've been the associate pastor. I've been the second chair, right? And so what I've learned is to follow wherever my senior pastor wants to go. Now, I know we have a senior pastor on here. So, line groups up with where you're headed, because that way with what you're the most excited about. And that's the way to do it. So I told him, I said, here's the thing. I found a study guide that we can use about the Passion of the Christ, but we need to make it easy for anybody to do a group. So we need to create a video. I said, and you need to be on the video. And he agreed. So I got out my home video camera, and we put him on a bar stool in the auditorium and put a couple ficus trees behind him. And I had my home video camera. And then for our teleprompter, we took his notes and we blew them up on giant pieces of paper on the copy machine and taped them together. And we put them on a music stand that's right underneath the camera. I mean, I just did a video shoot at a beautiful studio in Orange County. And looking back to what we did then, it was hilarious. But the truth is, it was popular because it was our pastor. Even though the quality was not, but it also didn't cost us $30,000, right? So this is going back. So we output this to VHS tape. Now, here was the trick. We decided to form these groups 3 weeks before the series was about to start. So we didn't have time to shoot all 6 videos to be ready for the series ahead of time. So we shot the videos 1 week at a time. I did the editing on my laptop. I went to the duplicate. We had this video tape exchange in my office every week. Where was YouTube? That's what I want to know. YouTube would have been very helpful. iPhones would have been very helpful. It could have saved me a lot of trouble. But anyway, so I had this tape exchange going on in my office. So every week, the leaders would bring in last week's tape. I would give them this week's tape. I would take last week's tape to the duplicator, and it would become next week's tape. And we did this for 6 weeks in a row. And looking back, I'm just thinking, thank God nobody got sick. I don't know how we would have pulled it off. But here's the key. He stood up on a Sunday morning. My senior pastor stood up on a Sunday morning, and he said, we've prepared some materials to go along with this Passion series. He said, if you would be interested in starting a group, we'll help you get the group started. And we doubled our groups in 1 day. Now, bear in mind, it had taken 7 years to get to 30% of our adults in groups, and we doubled our groups in 1 day. Now, fast forward, within 6 months, we were actually at a place where we had 125% of our average adult attendance in groups. Real math. 800 adults on the weekend, 1,000 adults in groups. We had 103 groups in the fall of 2004. We had 105 groups in the new year in 2005, and then we were able to maintain those numbers. Now, that's not some funny pastor math. We had groups that met in break rooms at work. We had groups that met in coffee shops and in neighborhoods. We had one group that met on a commuter train that went from Stockton, California to San Jose, and every Tuesday morning on the train, they did a Bible study. Now, this was the church I served in California. I was there from 1990 until 2006. And then in 2007, I came to Brookwood Church in Simpsonville, South Carolina, which is here next to Greenville in the path of Hurricane Flo, as we call her now. And it was a much larger church, about 5,000 adults on the weekend, but they had about 120 groups. So we had about 30% connected in groups. And we actually got to a place in this church where we had, I came across a list the other day, a spreadsheet that had the leader's name, their email address, their phone number. I say that so you know I'm legit. There were names of 600 leaders for the first series we launched at this church. We did a series called Wrestling with God based on the life of Jacob. And it was an 8-week series. And we went from 120 groups. I think some of the 600 were married, led together. But we went from 120 groups to something like 400 groups. Again, our pastor recruiting from the platform. So going back, I used to handpick the leaders. Nobody led a group in my church unless I invited them to lead. Because, hi, my name is Alan. I'm a recovering control freak. And but here's the thing. Once my senior pastor back in 2004 for that Passion of the Christ series stood up and invited people to do a group, and we doubled in a day, I have not recruited one small group leader since 2004. And I served this church that's pictured on the screen since then. Because I knew that if I took the same words and gave them to my senior pastor, he would have a far better result. So a couple of other churches I worked with. This is Van Dyke Church down in the Tampa area. Church of about 1,800 on the weekend. They were stuck at about 30%. They had about 400 adults in groups when I first went to work with them. Again, produced curriculum with their pastor on it. I'm not here to sell curriculum, but if you want to learn how to do it, I can teach you. We added some new strategies to how they recruited leaders, how they formed groups. The first round, they added 60 new groups. So they went from 400 people in groups, just to use the even math, 400 in groups to 1,000 in groups the first time they did the series. Now, the second series, and I don't have a slide for this, this was in the fall of 2011. The second series they did in the new year of 2012, and again, they created their own curriculum. I did coaching. They did all the work, which is much better than creating it yourself. And the second series, they went from 1,000 in groups to 1,600 in groups. And then the third series, they launched off of Easter in 2012, and they went from 1,600 in groups to over 2,000 in groups at that point, and maintained that for quite a while. Now they're going into multiple campuses and renegotiating all of that. New Life Church in Renton, Washington. This is Pastor Troy Jones. The church of 2,500 adults. And Brendan, you'll have to forgive me. I'm using American church numbers. So I know, in Canada, your mega church is defined much differently. So forgive me. But anyway, so a church of 2,500 adults. They were stuck at about 40%. They had 100 groups when we started. Again, made curriculum based on the pastor's teaching, added some new ways of doing groups, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. We added 400 new groups. So in 6 months, they went from 100 groups to 500 groups. Technically, then, they had 25 people in their weekend services. They had 5,000 people in groups. And what Pastor Troy discovered was that people were being introduced to him and to the church through the video teaching because their friends had invited them over to do a Bible study with them. Now, this is Renton, Washington. This is not the buckle of the Bible Belt. This is 3,000 miles from the buckle of the Bible Belt. In fact, I was coaching a church in Redmond, Washington, and the small group pastor there said, not unlike Canada, he said, if you're a Christian here, you better mean it because it's going to cost you something. And so a very different dynamic. But what the pastor was seeing was as people were being invited to groups, then they were being invited to church. So in the comfort of their friend's home, they were introduced to the teaching. They were introduced to the pastor on video. And so he saw how this worked so well at getting people then to start coming to church. They actually made it a goal for a church of 2,500 to start 1,000 groups in the community to reach people that way, since they weren't walking in the front door on Sunday morning anymore. So just a thought. So going back to our reasons we were stuck, we already have our low-hanging fruit. We have our early adopters. Maybe we're hand-picking leaders, forming groups only one way. And then, we need the coaching piece. So here's what we're going to talk about, how to break through this 30% barrier. I'll give you the slides and a copy of the recording after the webinar is over. I'll email those to you so you don't have to get writer's cramp during the webinar. But we're going to cover each of these. We're going to talk about opening up your leader recruiting. And as I list these, don't become overwhelmed, because the reality is if you just change one of these things, it can make a dramatic impact in how your group launch goes this fall. So open up your leader recruiting. Consider new curriculum options. Let your senior pastor, get your senior pastor to recruit new leaders. Get your coaching structure started, and leave your established groups alone. So Sunday school classes, midweek Bible studies, groups that have been meeting for years, other kinds of Bible studies, support groups, they're connected. They're doing something intentional about their spiritual growth. You don't need to convert all of them over to a new system. Unless you specifically have the gift of martyrdom, then go right ahead. But anyway, you don't need to go there. And so you already have those. I had a woman years ago called me, and we were talking about her groups, and they had about 300 or 400 people in their church. And she kept saying, what about Sunday school? What about Sunday school? What about Sunday school? As we're talking about groups, because her idea was we got to have everybody in one system, right? I said, how many people do you have in Sunday school? She says, well, we have 2 classes and they each have about 20 people. So at a church of 400, they had 40 people in Sunday school, and she's worried about Sunday school. I said, let's do this. I said, let's go after the 360 people who are not in Sunday school, who are only attending the worship service. And then after we have those 360 connected into groups, then we can go back and talk about what about Sunday school. But there was no reason to break that up. My litmus test is this. Unless they're talking bad about the pastor or worshiping the devil, just let them continue to do what they're doing. They're not hurting anybody. All right, so let's go on. So opening up your leader recruiting. What do you look for when you're recruiting leaders? So what are your requirements? So some churches, they're looking for the next Billy Graham. Maybe they're looking for the next Mother Teresa. So do they need to be a member? Do they need to have been a Christian for a certain amount of time or have a certain level of spiritual maturity? Do they need to go through extensive training? I had one church that in order to be a leader in their church, you had to go through 1 year of leadership training. And then they wondered why their small groups weren't growing. Maybe they need to have a master of divinity, and then they're qualified to lead a small group. So what you have to come down to is this. What is your acceptable level of risk? Now, some churches will say, well, if you're breathing and you're willing, you are qualified and we'll take you, and they let anybody lead. Some churches will say, well, anybody could lead, but we have to have kind of certain qualifications met. And then, some will say, well, they can lead after they're vetted. If we don't know them, we at least have an interview, find out where they are, make sure they're not axe murderers or drug dealers or something. Which, drug dealers have a network, so that wouldn't be too bad to get groups going there. But anyway, but you don't want to advertise them to your church. I'm a little punchy today. I don't know. Maybe it's because this hurricane's coming and it's got everything stirred up. All right, so let's go on. Dr. Tony Evans at Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas was meeting with their leadership and for their small groups, and they said, oh, well, here's one thing. And I knew Dr. Evans was all in favor of multiplying the groups in his church and getting all kinds of new leaders, and he had committed to developing video curriculum. But they said, here's the thing. We have one requirement for anybody who wants to lead. They need to be a member. And I thought, oh, no, we're not going to even start 50 groups in this church. I said, well, how many members do you have? They said, well, we have 7,000 members. I said, well, I can work with that. No problem. 7,000 members. Now, the other thing that they said was they required 1 year of leadership training in order to be a leader. And where we were going to go with that is just kind of give them a briefing and give them, an experienced leader to help coach them and along with the team. Well, this got out to some of their established leaders that had gone through the year of training and they had been leading for a while, met all the qualifications. And they said, well, if you let anybody in, this is one of my meetings with them over a go-to meeting like this. If you let anybody in, this is the report back, we're going to have all kinds of problems. And how do you know that they're qualified? And, it's just going to be chaos. So, you guys need to rethink this. So I let the staff rehearse all of this, knowing that these weren't just the staff people's issues. These were also, they weren't just the leaders' issues. They were also some of the staff members' issues. And so they kind of went through everything they were going through, and I was listening. And at that point, I'm praying, Lord, give me something to say, because I thought we're dead in the water. And so they got quiet. They were finished. And I said, this isn't a call to leadership. This is a call to obedience, because we're all called to go and make disciples. And you can hear a pin drop in that conversation. And I thought, uh-oh, I've killed it. And somebody finally spoke up and they said, would you repeat that? I said, well, this isn't a call to leadership. It's a call to obedience, because we're all called to go and make disciples. And then we were fine. So Dr. Evans preached this beautiful message on community on Labor Day weekend. Oh, who told him to preach on Labor Day weekend? Well, this is Dr. Tony Evans. Nobody tells him to do anything. So he preached this message on Labor Day weekend. He had 270 people sign up to lead groups. And then they had to go through and make sure they were all members. By the end of 3 weeks of recruiting, they had recruited 500 people to lead groups. See, again, this American math. But it was a pretty remarkable story. And again, with the qualification on there. So you think about, you want people to try to lead a group. Most people don't consider themselves to be any kind of a leader. So if you do something that's easy to use and you ask them to invite their friends, maybe you don't even advertise their group. Maybe they're responsible for inviting their friends. I used to tell people out in California, before we do our signups, if I were you, I would go ahead and fill your groups up with your friends. Otherwise, you might end up with a bunch of weirdos. And I live in South Carolina now. We're too polite to say things like that here. But anyway, but the idea is, they're not signing on to do a group forever. They're signing on to do a group maybe for one series or one semester. And so you think about like when you go to buy a car. And so when you go to buy a car, if you want to take the car home with you, there's a lot of paperwork to fill out. There's legal stuff. There's, if you're taking out a loan or leasing it or whatever, there's a lot of paperwork to take it home. But if you want to try out the car, they usually give you a test drive. And so what's required for a test drive? Well, the test drive is they require you to have a driver's license that you can legally drive, and they usually require the salesperson to go with you to make sure that you don't take it home without filling out all the paperwork or stealing it. So sometimes with our groups, because people don't think of themselves as leaders, I used to try to recruit them. Hey, would you like to be a small group leader? Well, sure. What are the terms? I said, well, the rest of your life. That was too big of a commitment. And so if you say, well, would you lead a group for the next 6 weeks? Would you lead a group for the next semester? We're giving them a test drive. And so like the car test drive, the salesman goes with them. So I give them an experienced leader that's going to walk alongside them and help them answer their questions, encourage them. But then what is that driver's license? That's what your church has to decide. Because for some churches, like Tony Evans, the driver's license was you have to be a member. Some churches, the driver's license is you have to be willing, and we'll take you. Some churches, the driver's license is you have to apprentice in a group for a period of time and prove your stuff before you can lead a group. Whatever that is, you have to decide what the acceptable level of risk is for your church, because it has to be right for you. Because if I were to say, well, the best way to do this is whatever, and tried to push you into something that was incredibly uncomfortable for you, the truth is that if we succeeded, we would actually be succeeding at something that was probably maybe your greatest fear, that people I don't know and have never heard of and don't know where they came from are going to be leading groups in my church. And it took me a little while to embrace that. I learned the key was that I don't advertise those groups. They just go in and invite their friends, and that worked out a lot better. But I may be getting ahead of myself, so let's keep going on. Change up your curriculum a little bit. So is your curriculum or sermon discussion guide, is it getting in the way? Some people say, well, I'm not a leader. I'm not a teacher. And so if you do some kind of a discussion guide or discussion questions based on your message, you could add a little video to it. And so there's some pastors. I was just talking to a pastor yesterday out in California, and he has a church of 300. He has a church of 300 people, and he has 300 people in small groups. And now they got to reach out, to their community. But what he does is on Sunday morning, either before or after the service, he does a 5-minute video that they shoot with an iPhone. And then they upload the iPhone to you, or they upload the video to YouTube. And that's their video piece of their curriculum. They take the link from YouTube, they put it in the notes. So they click the link, they watch the video as a group, and then they answer the questions. And that's their video-based curriculum. So the new iPhone just came out. It's $1,100 US. If you're working on your budget for next year, say, guess what? I need to have this new iPhone in order to make video curriculum. That's what the guy on the webinar told me. Go right ahead. But you don't. You could use your Android. You could use whatever. You could use your home video camera that still has a tape like I did. But again, some little change to make it easy for your people to do. So they don't feel like I have to be the teacher. The teacher is my pastor that's on the video. And in the process of doing that, as they invite their friends, neighbors, coworkers, other people that they know in the community to come and join a group, then they're introduced to the pastor and the teaching through that video. And that may get them one step closer to coming to church. So encourage your pastor to create curriculum, maybe do an alignment series or a curriculum option of some kind. You don't have to write the next purpose-driven life. I mean, there are different ways to do this. You can take Saddleback does a lot of curriculum, and if you call them and say, hey, I like your book, but I'd like to do my own video, they'll give you permission to do your own video based on their curriculum. There's some pastors that I've worked with that we've just gone back and looked at sermon series that they did in the past, and we just took their previous sermon series, edited it down to 10-minute scripts, put it in a teleprompter, and then that was their video curriculum. And easy enough. Because even if the production is not at the level of some stuff that you would purchase, it doesn't matter, because your people would rather have you than any of these well-named pastors that they don't know. So unfortunately, in recent years, a lot of these well-named pastors haven't done so well. Things were found out. You're not going to be using their videos anymore. And that's unfortunate. All right. But consider an alignment series. And this is where the group study goes along with the weekend messages. And you could do this different ways. You could either create your own with your own video. You can find a book and create your video with somebody else's book. Or you can do like we did 40 Days of Purpose, and you buy somebody else's campaign, and then you preach the sermons on the weekend and invite people, or have the senior pastor invite people to lead these groups, to join these groups. We used to think back with 40 Days of Purpose and some of those that the key to all of that was Rick Warren, which, Rick Warren's nothing to sneeze at, second best-selling nonfiction book of all time next to the Bible. But the reality is the success of that campaign in churches had more to do with the senior pastor's involvement in recruiting leaders and getting people excited about small group. It had more to do with the senior pastor's involvement than it did about Rick Warren. And I used to be a member at Saddleback, so I have nothing against Pastor Rick at all. But the truth is, people want to see you. They laugh at your jokes. They, all of that. So we're going to get in that in a minute. If you've never done this, then you want to probably plan for 2 or 3 alignments in a ministry season. So typically the school year, September to May. Do one in the fall, do one in the new year, do one after Easter. And your seasons. For American churches, I always say finish by Thanksgiving. For Canadian churches, I say start at Thanksgiving and be done well in advance of the Christmas season. But in that window where people are going to be, they're back in church, they're going to be engaged. After the new year, I used to try to start in January, and then I found out we didn't have enough time to recruit people. And so the new year, we started doing the series between the Christian holidays of Super Bowl Sunday and Easter. And that was a good window. In fact, a lot of them, they would start their group with a Super Bowl party. And then, go from there. And then after Easter, finishing up by the end of May, because then when the weather gets nice, people want to be out and enjoy the nice weather. Except, people that are in Florida and stuff always have nice weather, so they don't worry about that so much. It gets hot, though. If you've done an alignment before, then you probably just want to do one big alignment a year, either in the fall or in the new year, just to generate some excitement and get groups going. Like I said before, you want your senior pastor to be your small group champion. And so put your pastor on the curriculum. So if your pastor is on the curriculum, your pastor is going to be more interested in groups and what's going on because he's made an investment. So this pastor down at Van Dyke Church in Florida, we spent a whole day coaching their team. They're shooting the video. The next day, he pulls us into his office and he says, now we've shot this video. Now, how are we going to recruit leaders? How are we going to get people connected into groups? And his discipleship pastor came to me later in the day and said, I've been trying to get my senior pastor interested in small groups for 2 years. He said, and you just did it, almost like an accusation. And I just smiled at him and said, well, I'm Alan White. No, I actually did not say that. What happened was, because the pastor had made an investment of putting his teacher on the video, he wanted to make sure that thing was going to be a winner. And so he was more engaged. So here's the other thing that happened. The people in your congregation will be more interested in the teaching if it's your senior pastor. Because if they're not connected to each other than Jesus, the reason people attend your church is because of your senior pastor. They like his personality. They like his teaching style. They laugh at his jokes. Now, please don't share this with your worship pastor because it'll break his heart. But it's the senior pastor is the guy. So when the senior pastor said, hey, we developed curriculum based on my teaching, well, you're giving your people more of what they already like. And then when the pastor gives the direction of, would you open up your home and invite some people that maybe make it open for people to sign up or whatever, well, people are going to follow your pastor's leadership. Not all of them initially, But over time, as you do several waves of this, they'll begin to follow. You also want to give small group solutions to the things your pastor is concerned about. So what do pastors worry about? Attendance, spiritual growth, closing the back door, outreach, finances, stuff like that. So I could give you all kinds of stories of how groups are the best things since sliced bread, but I'll give you research instead. So 2 books. One is Transformational Groups by Ed Stetzer and Eric Geiger. Came out of Lifeway Research. The other one is called Sharing the Journey by Robert Wuthnow. This book is probably about 20, 25 years old. Robert Wuthnow was a professor at Princeton University when he did the study. Now, the interesting thing is the very different organizations that did this research from 25 years in between when they were written, and yet they come to the same conclusions about people in groups. And what they find is these studies have said that groups will increase connection in your church. And so this, addresses the assimilation issue. It increases spiritual growth. So it helps with discipleship. It increases attendance, because one of the things we found is that if you're doing a sermon series and a curriculum that go together, that people will attend more often on the weekend because they know that the Sunday sermon or the weekend sermon message is going to be connected to what they're doing in their group. So they will attend more consistently. Whereas the average person in North America attends 1.6 times a month. And so when you're in a series like this, they will attend more often because they know that it has something to do. And then, of course, the outreach component we talked about, that people come to a group. Then you would, hey, he's talking about this on Sunday. You want to come to the service with us? And so that increases attendance as well. People that are in groups serve more than people that aren't in groups. And people that are in groups give more than people that aren't in groups. In fact, the Transformational Groups book said that group members give 4% more than people that aren't in groups. So I will give you one anecdote. And I was working with a church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania a few years ago. And they did one thing new. They created curriculum and did these church-wide alignments with the sermon series and recruited people into groups. When they got to the end of, we started in January, ended in June, got all kinds of people into groups. They compared, this was 2015. They compared this first 6 months of 2015 to the first 6 months of 2014. And what they discovered was this, and the only thing they did different was to create curriculum and to emphasize groups. They found that their attendance had increased by 7.5% over the previous year, and their giving had increased by 7% over the previous year. And that was from Nate Grella, who's their executive pastor. And the only thing they did different was they created their own curriculum and they connected people into groups. All right, so get your coaching structure started. So as you're developing small groups, as you're recruiting leaders, your group leaders need to have support. We started groups one year. We started 10. This was back in 1994, 10 years before the Passion of the Christ. And all of the groups went for a whole year. And then at the end of the year, they all quit. We said, well, what's the deal? They said, well, we felt like Lone Rangers out there. Our church was only about 350 people. We talked to these leaders all the time, but because we weren't intentionally coaching them on their role in small groups, they felt like they were Lone Rangers and it was all up to them, and they felt kind of abandoned. And so you want to get something started. So don't coach alone. Exodus 18, Jethro's advice to Moses. He said, you want to have leaders of 10, and those are your small group leaders. He said, you want to have leaders of 50s and 100s. Those are your coaches. And then you want to have leaders of thousands, which would be kind of a leadership team that would be leaders of leaders of leaders. So the church in California, I had 800 on the weekend. I didn't have thousands. So we had coaches, and the coaches were our small group leadership team, and then they served the small group leaders. And then in this church in Simpsonville, 5,000 adults on the weekend. I had a leadership team, and then we had each had coaches, and then the coaches served leaders. And this wasn't just to create a nice organizational chart. It was about having these relational connections to encourage these leaders and keep them going. So I just show right. So don't feel guilty about coaching that hasn't happened. When I had 30 groups with my 30 leaders, I didn't coach them very well. And I felt guilty about that. But what I discovered was I had a wonderful, wonderful pool of potential coaches that could help the new leaders. So when we doubled in a day, I was overwhelmed. I thought, I can't coach 30 very well. How am I going to coach 60? And then I realized, wait a minute, if I double, that means half of them know what they're doing, half of them don't know what they're doing. So I just matched them up. I created the buddy system. And that's how we did our coaching. Don't inflict established leaders with new coaching. You have to, coach leaders according to what they need. And if they've been around for a while, they haven't been coached very much, I would focus on the new ones. Have your established leaders help the new ones. And then when you get further down the road, then worry about the ones that you've had going. An alignment series is a trial run for leading a group. Well, I would say coaching could be a trial run for somebody that's coached. You want a short-term commitment, and then you evaluate that. So for an experienced leader that wants to maybe try coaching, this is what I have them do. I have them call the new leader once a week from when the leader says yes until the end of the series. They answer their questions, they encourage them, they pray for them. That's the job description. And then at the end of the series, we evaluate. And again, it's only for a short term. It's not forever. So if they enjoyed coaching others and they were effective and they'd like to coach some more, then I invite them to coach more. But if they didn't like coaching and they weren't effective and they don't want to coach anymore, I thank them for fulfilling their commitment, their short-term commitment, and then move on. Okay, and the thing I kind of camped on a little bit at the beginning was the idea of leaving established leaders alone. If you have 30% in groups or 50% in groups or 2% in groups, don't upset that. Let them continue what they're doing. So even if it's Bible study or adult Sunday school or midweek Bible study or something that we feel like it's kind of old-fashioned, hey, as long as it's working for somebody, let it work for that group of people. Because if you threaten that, then those people will be opposed to small groups because they see the success of small groups as a defeat of something that they love and that they're comfortable with and that they've committed to. Now, over time, as you emphasize small groups and de-emphasize these other things, they may come over to small groups, but I wouldn't push that too fast. You could invite them to be part of an alignment series. You could invite them to do the same curriculum everybody else is doing, but I wouldn't make it mandatory. I mean, I live in a state with no helmet law. We don't make anything mandatory here. So think about this. If you have 30% of your people in groups, then that means 70% of your people have said no to whatever approach, whatever invitation that you've given them in the past. 30 said yes, 70 said no. So you want to keep the 30 where they're at, happy, but what do you do with the 70%? You want to give them something that they could say yes to. So change something. Remember my 5-year plan? See, for 7 years, I asked people the same question. Do you want to lead a group? And if they said no to that, then I needed to give them something to say yes to. So after 7 years, we changed from handpicking leaders to what we called host home. You weren't a leader, you were a host, and that's language we borrowed from Saddleback, and then people would sign up to be in your group. Now, 2 years after that, I would invite these hosts into a briefing. Well, I'm standing there 2 years later in a briefing and nobody's there. There are no new hosts. And so we actually started a different strategy we called Gather and Grow, where basically you said, I want to lead a group. The group was invitation only. So it was up to the leader to invite 100% of the people that were going to be in the group. And we wouldn't advertise them. Nobody, could sign up to be in their group, but they would invite everybody into the group because for some people, that was an easier place for them to start. So that's where we started. So again, if you just change one thing, just one change could get your groups unstuck very quickly. Now we're going to take a few minutes for questions, but I got to give you a little, advertisement in the meantime. So if you stick with me to the end here, I'll send you the first chapter out of my book. And if you already have the first chapter, tell me and I'll send you the second chapter. All right. I'm starting a coaching group for pastors in January. It's going to go for 12 months. And this is what we do in the coaching group. In January, we do a church-wide assessment. We collect some data. We look at obstacles. We look at opportunities for groups. Then January through June, for that 6 months, we meet as a group. We do some training. We meet twice a month. We also do a monthly one-on-one call with me and you, and then whoever of your staff you want to join in. So we do that for 6 months. And then, so it's kind of 6 months of training and then 6 months of implementation. So then July through December, so my current group, we're in this implementation phase. We do individual calls and we talk about the specific things that are going on with your ministry, kind of obstacles you need to overcome, plans, this sort of thing of how do we fine tune this and make it fit with your church. Because the reality is every church is different. So I bring a certain amount of best practices from all of these churches that I've had an opportunity to work with. But what that has to do is we have to find the place where the best practices intersect with the culture and the uniqueness of your church. And that's the sweet spot. And so nothing works exactly the same in every church, but we can adapt things so that it will work given your specific circumstances. Like I'm going to see a church next week, do an onsite with this church in Orlando. The last thing in the world this church wants is to do any kind of a church-wide campaign. But they've got a bit of a mess. So I'm going to go in and, do some research and have a lot of conversations and do a lot of listening and see if I can help them untangle this knot that they've developed. So anyway, every church is different. So in the coaching group, we'll cover 3 launches that could happen next year, New Year, Easter, maybe the fall. Best practices, local customization, like I said. Reaching your small group goals for 2019. I didn't change that date yet. So, how many new leaders do you want? How many new members? How many new coaches? The training method is I work with 5 churches at a time in each group. And the reason for that is I want everybody to be able to get their word in. And, we meet on GoToMeeting. We look like the Brady Bunch on the camera. But we learn from each other and we learn together. I do kind of a flip learning model. And the idea is that you would take the lecture part of it. It's very unlike this webinar. It's less of me talking and more of kind of facilitating in the group. But to prepare for that, we either read a chapter of the book together. I have a couple of courses, one on launching groups, one on coaching groups. And so you would watch a video. It's the investment's about an hour a week. And so you would spend an hour preparing, and then the opposite week, we would spend an hour together. And then, when we're together, it's more of a lab format where it's an online discussion. We talk about things that we've dealt with, things that we've tried, things we have in common. And it's interesting to me that churches in different parts of North America, churches of different backgrounds, denominations, and cultures can really engage in helping each other and processing all of these things. So it's been kind of a fun thing. That's why I've done this the last several years in a row. What else comes with the coaching is executable timelines and support to achieve your goals. So like this is not cookie cutter. Every church is in a different place with their groups, and we embrace that and try to figure out what's going to work best for you. A private Facebook group where we interact some, when we're not together. We record all the meetings and they're held in a Dropbox folder. They're not available to anybody who's not in the group. So that way, if you've shared things in the group that you don't want to get out, that it's available to you forever. You can go back and review things, but it's not available to anybody else. Tools, samples, intellectual property. So things that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can kind of just take some examples of things and tweak it, and that becomes yours. Get a copy of both my books. Like I said, the group's going to start in January of next year. So the money part, the assessment we would start with is normally $1,000. The books, 2 courses are $249 each, and then the individual calls are $150 each. So, and that's not counting in the time with the group. So over $3,000 worth of stuff. If I were to coach you individually, churches I work with pay $1,000 to $3,000 per month for 12 months for that. And so what I'm doing with this coaching group is the first option is everything I described. Depending on the size of your church, it's $1,500 to $2,500 for the year. So if your church is under 500 people, it's $1,500. If you're between 500 and 1,000, it's $2,000. If you're over 1,000, it's $2,500. Or you can make 5 payments, set it up on a credit card or whatever. The other option would be that that I would come and visit you for a day and do the assessment in person. And it's a little bit more. I would be there for a full day with you and your team. It includes travel costs. I mean, Toronto is not that far away, so we might be able to include travel costs on that too. I just have to renew my passport, that's all. But anyway, those are options, something to think about, as you're thinking about budgets for next year. The one thing that I will say is that if you register now, so this is September, if you register now, then your coaching starts now as far as your one-on-ones. So I have a church that registered last month for the January group. So I'm going to coach. We had a call in August. So August, September, October, November, December. So he gets 5 months of one-on-ones before the 12-month even starts. So he's getting 17 months of one-on-ones plus the coaching group and the assessment and all of that when it starts. And that's kind of been helpful to him as he's launched this fall. The only pressure on this is that once 5 churches have registered, then the group is sold out, and then I start a waiting list. And if there are 5 more churches, we start a second group. If they're not, then we just kind of wait till the next year. For the group that's starting in January, I already have 3 spots that are full. So I have 2 spots that are left. And this is not like some sleazy sales technique. I have 3 churches that signed up and I only take 5. That's the reality. So the only pressure is, you either have to start before the group fills up or you have to sign up before January 1st. Those are the deadlines. So if you're interested in this, you can contact me, my email address, or call me on my cell phone, and we can go from there. So if you're interested, just pulled up something that I wasn't supposed to have. All right. If you're interested in this, you can contact me. Otherwise, I'll open this up for any questions that you might have about groups. I'll unmute everybody if you want to talk. Otherwise, you can use the chat window either way. But questions about groups, thoughts. You ended up at the wrong place, but you've been polite, so you just stayed in, or anyway. So what are your thoughts? Where are your groups at, and how can I answer a question for you before we have to go? I have to pick up my 5-year-old. My wife and 2 children are on their way to Olympia, Washington for her grandfather's 95th birthday, and so I have to pick our 5-year-old up. I have the 5-year-old and the 13-year-old here with me, so I have to pick my 5-year-old up from preschool in a little bit, but I don't have to go for a little bit, so I can answer questions if you guys have got them. So you can either flip on your mic and talk, or you can type in the chat. Either way you want to go. Hey, Brendan, thanks for being with us. I understand you have to jump, so God bless. All right, Mike, it's you and me. What do you think?
No, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's all great stuff. I mean, it's funny because we do kind of a hybrid. I mean, we create like a weekend study guide based on our sermon series that we're in.
Uh-huh.
And it's been good, but I feel like we've been doing it for too long. So I'm trying to think of ways where we can, maybe do I've had some group leaders come to me and say, we'd really like to do a study by this person or that person or whatever, so they kind of, the longer they're in a small group at our church, they kind of like, I mean, and the weekend sermons are great.
Yeah.
It's funny, as you were on the webinar, I emailed my pastor and I just said, hey, we should consider recording some, 3 to 5 minute videos recapping the message, or, that way you can be in front of our small groups more, that kind of stuff. So that's something I actually,
oh, that's cool.
As you were talking,
you already have a takeaway.
Yeah, I kind of said, hey, I emailed actually him and one of our video guys, and I just said, hey, let's talk about if this is something, I mean, I think for me, go ahead.
No, you're fine.
I think for me, some of the challenge arises just on, obviously he's got, a ton going on and on his mind and whatever. And so, the whole idea of him being the primary like small group champion, you know what I mean? Because, I've read, and I'm not even really our small groups pastor. I kind of oversee all of our ministries more like in an executive pastor role.
Oh, okay.
But we're minus a connections person right now.
Okay.
And that's what I was originally hired for 8 or 9 years ago. And so that's really kind of my, my forte. So I'm kind of in it again, doing it. And so just trying to figure out how we can, jump it up to the next level. And I would say we're probably right about that 30%. I mean, we have a, 900 to 1,000 weekend attendance, and we've got, about 300 people in groups, so just trying to think of ways that we can, re-energize things,
Yeah, and the way of, the pastor being this small group champion, I mean, this is what I used to do with my pastor here in Greenville, is we would recruit for 3 weeks in a row. We would recruit leaders, and then people would get the clue that, oh, something's happening. Maybe these groups are starting. We spent 3 weeks recruiting leaders, and we would do like a sign-up day where they would come and they would meet the leaders and then sign up face-to-face. But the leader had been recruiting, kind of like what I was saying before. But what I did with my pastor was I would do a little half sheet of paper that I would take to his office 30 minutes before the first service started.
Yeah.
And I'd hand him the paper and I'd say, today I need you to hit on this, this, and this.
Okay.
And he'd say, okay, I got it. And then he would come out, and he's a South Georgia boy, so he'd come out and do his bit. And he'd do a beautiful job. And then we sent them to a briefing, and then I was there to brief them. So it was my responsibility from that point forward. Then the second week, took my little half sheet of paper, tried it into a study, which was off the platform, told him, okay, today we're going to go this angle, this, and this. And he's like, got it. And then he didn't want all 3 weeks in a row. Some guys want to say, well, let's see the progression of this. I did some work with Chip Ingram, and Chip was like, he wants to see the whole thing of where he goes. And, Chip's 2,200 on the weekend. They had 100 groups. We had 400 groups for Holy Ambition a couple years ago. Wow. And so again, it's a matter of, he just needs to be the spokesperson. Now, sometimes the dilemma a pastor gets in is he's not in a group.
Well, I mean, and honestly, and it's funny because as we have meetings and talk and whatnot, we talk about, because I mean, I get it. I mean, I've done a small group ever since I've been at our church, because obviously I was hired to do small groups, and I see the value of them. But my group is constantly full. Yeah, because I'm a pastor, I'm on staff. People want to know, and I think the same thing for him. So we've talked about. And I know, I've heard that, the Andy Stanleys and the Craig Rochelles that, man, every weekend they're telling stories of, hey, my small group, here's what we talked about, or we went through this in my small group. And, so that just builds value that, wow, if that's something and I'm not necessarily dogging and saying, he doesn't buy into them. I think he does, but I don't think he's not actively in one or part of one right now. And we talked about like, hey, maybe if you did one to like for new and young leaders that I think all that stuff is great. We've never really taken it to let's figure out how to do that. So I think, and I'll be real. I mean, our staff isn't largely involved in them either. And so rather than say, I mean, we have some that are, and I go around and say, hey, I'd love for you to lead one. I'd love for you to this or that. But it's not really like hey, if you're going to be here, this is something you have to do. You know what I mean? Well,
and if it's forced and they're not drawn to it, then
you don't want to.
That kind of it's like, I don't even know if I'd want to be part of that group, even if I was leading it. I think for your pastor, sometimes the workaround is to find something that he can call his small group. So if he has a couple of pastors that he prays with, if he has some golfing buddies that they go out and play golf once a week, I mean, find something that he can refer to as his small group. So then when he's recruiting people to be in groups, he doesn't feel disingenuous because he has a small group.
Right.
But because, I mean, you're brave. I've done enough groups over the years that anything that's called a pastor's small group, I don't want to be a part of it because that attracts a very unique element of people.
Yeah. I mean, no, absolutely. And honestly, I've got those people in my current group that I mean, I talk to my wife all the time. I'm like, I wish I could not have so-and-so come because, I mean, I have my wife and I have a passion, to help, couples and marriages and parenting and, that kind of thing, because we've been
Yeah.
through it all. And then I've got, this 75-year-old guy and his wife showing up because it's me, because they want to know me or they want to meet me, and I get that dynamic. It's just, I think that overall momentum. And what's cool is, I mean, in a couple of weeks, we're going to start a series called Better Together. So it's kind of like I mean, we're in a series now, but the connection series, hey, serving and being in a loop, and we call our small groups loops. So
Oh, okay.
but so we're going to be doing that series where we're going to be making more of a hardcore push for them. But like this weekend, we're getting Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets. So if you sign up for a loop, you get a box of chicken nuggets, and all the hype type
Wow.
stuff.
Chick-fil-A
And my
on
wife
a Sunday.
my wife works at Chick-fil-A, so I have a
Oh, she
hookup.
does?
So yeah, she's a manager at a Chick-fil-A. So, but like we're gonna put nuggets in a little box and talk about. We're gonna have a couple small group leaders talk about them from the stage and do an interview, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to build the momentum. I think it's just how to, once you get, and what I've learned is once you get people in a small group, typically they stay there.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Typically they stay there. They see the value. They understand the importance of it. They're there. You know what I mean? But
Mm-hmm.
again, I think it's more just getting beyond that 300 mark and saying, man, what would it look like if we had 500 people in a small
Yeah.
group or
No, and
600?
and that was the thing. I mean, you're right about the size that we were at the church I served in California. And it really was that thing of, our pastor wasn't against small groups. I just didn't feel like he was in favor of them enough. But
Right.
by doing the curriculum, having him on the video, that got a lot more buy-in from him.
Yeah,
And then it was
and
a
I did.
matter.
I mean, that is literally one thing I just reached out literally as you were saying that. I was like, man, I don't think we would ever do a full blown like video study per se.
Yeah.
But if it was, and I even said, hey, what if we started like say the beginning of every series we do? Let's do a 5-minute like vision casting for from his heart on. Hey, here's why we're doing this series, and here's why it's important. And so every week as you meet in your loop, I encourage you to talk about these things, or what I mean, like so they can like see him once a month even, because obviously they see him on the stage every weekend. But like you said, we're in a size church where we're not giant, but we're not a church where everybody's going to know the pastor,
Right.
and
Right.
that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
And sometimes too, if you have to do all the videos ahead of time, it's a lot of preparation. But now with streaming video, that while it's fresh in his mind, as he's either beginning to start the series, or he's finished his message prep for that week, or he's even, between services and he's already preached it, and kind of what's that 5-minute nugget that he can give that can engage people
Yeah.
into doing something that with him on it. And one of the things we discovered with our pastor here was, we had him do an 8-week series. And at one point his comment was, "You're working me like a dog." And I thought, I'm never going to get another whole series out of him again. And so what we started doing was we had him do the first week.
Yeah.
And then after that, we had the other pastors who taught that did the teaching for the remaining weeks. But at least we had a touch from him, and at least it got started, and so went along with his sermons. But again, just kind of a few more hooks of trying something new. And even this thing of tossing out the idea that you can do the series, but you could start a group and only invite your friends. And sometimes people who are more introverted, they would never host a group that 12 strangers are going to come to their house. But they might certainly, they invite 4 or 5 very good friends to come and do a study with them.
True.
And then you get into weird schedules, all that stuff people deal with.
Yeah. I mean, we used to be where, and it's funny because in the webinar you were talking about, we used to be where like, man, you had to be at the church for so many years and you had all these requirements, and, and now it's like, you know what, let's throw the net out really wide and then kind of, I mean, maybe this doesn't sound right, but kind of weed people out.
Mm-hmm. Or they weed themselves out.
Or they weed themselves out, right? And so, like a couple weeks ago, we had just a simple card that just said, "Hey, don't do life by yourself. launch a loop or, start a loop or, whatever. And then it was like, hey, if you're even interested in knowing more about this, it wasn't like by signing the card, you're committing your life away, but it's if you're remotely interested, so at least it prompted some conversations with people, that might be interested. And I mean, and so we gained 3 or 4 new, I don't know, maybe it's the Northeast, but we have a church that like waits till the last minute to do everything. I mean, that's probably just people, you know what I mean? But waits till the last minute to do everything. You print out 1,500 cards and nail it from the stage, and you'll get 5 cards turned in, or just very non-responsive, and it's like you got an area in the lobby, and you feel like in your head, man, this is completely clear, and everyone's going to want to do this, and then you get like 5 responses.